This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you Episode 1 of Season 4 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, January 7th, 1911. The first issue of 1911, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the About Town section. The WCTU, that's the Women's Christian Temperance Union, held its monthly meeting on Tuesday afternoon with Mrs. Emery J. Whitney on Main Street with 10 members present. A letter was read from Mrs. Armand. It's spelled A-R-M-O-N-D, but it's actually A-R-M-A-N-D, a missionary in the Philippines. The letter gave an interesting description of people's dress, social and religious life, schools, climate, and productions. Mrs. Armand will be remembered as the wife of a former pastor of the Methodist Episcopal Church at Granville. That would be Samuel Henry Armand, who was pastor from 1908 to 1910. Both Mr. and Mrs. Armand are missionaries, and they actually left the church in 1910 to become missionaries in the Philippines. A letter was also read from Representative Edward Fisher in answer to a previous letter from the WCTU in relation to matters of temperance legislation. A Boston party is soliciting milk of Westford farmers for Boston market. Patronage enough has already been secured to commence shipping from Westford Station. It is being collected by Henry Calm, living on the Blood Farm, which is now 39 Flag Road. And Henry spells his last name K-A-U-M, or at least the Wardsman paper spelled it that way. Word was received in town on Monday of the death in Worcester of Mrs. Elizabeth Harwood. Her maiden name was Tuttle, widow of Ephraim A. Harwood, at one time and for many years old-time residents of Brookside. Burial in Westford on Thursday afternoon. The next section is called Gatherings. The Pearlie A. Wrights, who recently bought the large production farm on the Tadmuck Road, had a real Christmas tree gathering. 14 were present at the dinner, and even this number did not crowd hospitality. Among those present were Mrs. Robinson, 72 years old, mother of Mrs. Wright, Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, Somerville, Mr. and Mrs. Shute, Hollis, New Hampshire, Mr. and Mrs. Youlden, Hudson, New Hampshire, that's spelled Y-O-U-L-D-E-N, representing Mr. Wright's sisters. The usual Christmas tree surprises and good cheer were part of the inherent hospitality. Following close on this gathering, though treeless, not cheerless, was the New Year gathering on Monday evening, a neighborhood friendship shake-hand affair and get acquainted with these new acquisitions to town and social life. This was done with conversation, games, phonograph, select readings, and supper. Mrs. Clara Grieg was imbued with the pioneer home missionary spirit and cleared the cobwebs of neighborhood inertia and garnished the way with enthusiasm, and from whom the respondents got their cue for marching. More such, and life would always have an edge. Mr. and Mrs. Wright had a host of the spirit of the generous host and hostess. Those present included Mrs. Robinson, Mr. and Mrs. David L. Grieg, Mr. and Mrs. John Feeney and John Feeney, Jr., Mr. and Mrs. J. Willard Fletcher, Mrs. John McMaster, Mrs. Eben Prescott, Miss Lucinda Prescott, Mr. and Mrs. William L. Woods, Miss Ida Walkton, William Reuben Taylor, and Mr. and Mrs. Samuel L. Taylor. The next section is the Forge Village section. The mill of the Abbott Worsted Company resumed work on Monday morning at the usual hour after being closed from Friday night for the annual stock taking and for the New Year's Day activities, I guess. Cameron School reopened on Monday after the Christmas vacation for 2 weeks. The home of Mr. and Mrs. John Carmichael was the scene on Saturday evening of a most enjoyable New Year party. It has been the custom for many years for the family and friends to gather here on New Year's Eve, and it certainly is looked forward to with anticipation yearly. The evening was spent in song and music, and at midnight a bountiful supper was served by the hostess, after which the old custom of, quote, letting in the new year, end quote, in various parts of the village took place. Mrs. Felix Leclerc and daughter Miss Annie Leclerc spent the New Year holidays with their daughter and sister, Mrs. Henry Byron of Marlborough. The many friends of Mrs. Miles Collins, who has been quite ill the past week, will be glad to know she is improving. Her daughter, Miss Violet Collins, is attending her mother. Mrs. Annie Keefe of Townsend Harbor was the guest over New Year at the home of her aunt, Mrs. John Carmichael. A very pretty surprise party took place on Saturday evening at the home of Mrs. Smith on Pond Street, when the friends of Mrs. Catherine O'Hara presented her with a beautiful parlor lamp, center table, and cover. Although completely surprised, Mrs. O'Hara is to start housekeeping shortly, and the well wishes of her friends go with her in her new home. I think this is probably Catherine, who was married to Patrick O'Hara, who would die in 1920, and he was a miner of sorts, I believe, and spent a lot of his time away from Westford. At the communion service held at St. Andrew's Mission on Sunday morning, there was an unusually large attendance, and in the evening also. Mr. Bumpus spoke before a large and appreciative audience. The choir of St. Andrew's Mission held their regular rehearsal on Wednesday evening, after which St. Andrew's Guild and a special parish meeting was held in Recreation Hall at 8 o'clock. The Ladies' Sewing Circle met on Wednesday afternoon at the usual hour. The officers for the coming year were elected, the following being the ones chosen: Mrs. Richard D. Prescott, President and Treasurer; Mrs. Henry Catchpole, Secretary. After the business was transacted, a dainty luncheon was enjoyed. The Daniel Gage Company, who were to cut ice on the pond on Tuesday, have had to postpone their work owing to the very warm weather of the past week, which has affected the ice to such an extent that it is now only a few inches in thickness. It is hoped that the cold wave, which came on Wednesday, will freeze the ice so that the work can begin shortly. The Daniel Gage Company was an ice cutting company and shipping company, and they also cut the ice every year on Spectacle Pond, which is on the border of Ayer and Littleton. Loyal Self-Help Lodge, which is of the Order of Oddfellows, held their regular meeting on Monday evening. The following officers were installed: Fred Naylor, N.G., Frederick Davis, V.G., Charles Flanagan, Election Secretary, I guess that is, ELEC period Secretary, John Burnett, Lecturer, Master and Chaplain, John Shackleton, G.M., Percy Wilson, W., William Derone, I.G., I think that's Inside Guard, Harry Wilson, R.S. to N.G., William Burnett, Treasurer, and William Baker, Personal Secretary. Mrs. Joseph Bennett spent the week in Stafford Springs, Connecticut, as guest of her mother, Mrs. Vickers. She brought home with her Miss Ruth Bennett, her little daughter, who has been spending the winter with Mrs. Vickers. Mr. and Mrs. Hugh Daly were the guests of Mrs. Daly's mother in Leominster over Christmas. Many people from this village attended the Stereopticon lecture given by Professor Turner in St. Catherine's Church, Graniteville, on Tuesday evening. The regular monthly meeting of the John Edwards Hose Company was held in their rooms on Wednesday evening. The meeting was called to order by Captain Richard D. Prescott and proved to be a very enthusiastic one. It is rumored that the one-session plan will be tried in Cameron Schools shortly. Instead of opening at 8:45 a.m. as at present, the school will begin at 8:30 and close at 1:30 p.m. with the necessary recesses, thus making the usual number of study hours. The Lowell and Fitchburg Street Railway Company, who heretofore have received their power from the Boston and Northern Railway Company, are now taking their power from the Lowell Electric Light Corporation. This change went into effect on January 1st and has necessitated the installation of 2 new transformers to the substation of the Lowell and Fitchburg Company in this village. The substation is in charge of Mr. Wood of Graniteville and Harry Brown of this village, who now will be compelled to work 12 hours each instead of 9 hours as formerly. I assume that's 12 hours a day, which is a pretty long work day. The next paragraph is called On a Visit. Joseph Orange, formerly of this village but now a member of the United States Marines, is visiting relatives and friends here on a 10 days furlough after a trip to the Philippine Islands. Mr. Orange enlisted 3 years ago and has now 8 months more to serve. It has been a sad homecoming for the young man, as very grave changes have taken place in his family. His father, Abram Orange, was drowned while Mr. Orange was on his way to Australia. His brother, Reuben Orange, his grandfather and grandmother, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Bennett, have all passed away, and his 2 youngest sisters are married and live out of town. Mr. Orange intends to return to the village after he serves the remainder of his time of enlistment. Next, we have the Westford Center section. The Edward M. Abbott Hose Company held their regular monthly meeting Tuesday evening at their headquarters on Boston Road. There was a full attendance. An oyster supper was served by Fred A. Smith. Albert W. Haywood was voted into membership. Arrangements were completed for the company's annual dance next Tuesday evening at the town hall. Brigham's Orchestra will be in attendance, and no pains will be spared to make it a successful and enjoyable event. An oyster supper will be served during intermission. One of Miss Miranda Luce's Christmas remembrances that she particularly prizes is a beautiful greeting card with autograph attached from the Honorable John D. Long of Hingham. Miss Luce was one of Mr. Long's pupils when he was preceptor of Westford Academy. That was in 1857 to 1859. And she, with many others of the Westford friends, enjoy the mutual treasuring of associations between Mr. Long and some of our residents. I might mention that John D. Long served as Secretary of the Navy, and prior to that he served as Governor of Massachusetts. He was under the Secretary of the Navy under Presidents McKinley, who died in office, and then Teddy Roosevelt. And he was responsible for sending the cannon that we see on our common in Westford today. Mr. and Mrs. Herbert V. Hildreth quietly observed the 25th anniversary of their marriage, December 30th. A gathering of the Christian Endeavor Society was held with Mrs. Wallace, the pastor's wife, at the parsonage on Monday evening. Every member was present, and it proved a most successful gathering. Since the start several months ago, under the direction of the pastor's wife, it has strengthened in interest and in membership, and is in a prosperous condition. The following officers were chosen: Otis Day, President; Ethel Richardson, Vice President; Ida Task, Secretary; Pauline Wallace, Treasurer. At the social hour, refreshments were served. At the Tadmont Club next Tuesday afternoon, the dates and topics of Mr. and Mrs. Wallace's afternoons have been reversed, and Mr. Wallace will present, quote, the spiritual message of Robert Browning, end quote. Let the members start the first meeting of the new year with a good attendance. Robert Browning was born in 1812 and died in 1819 and was one of the foremost poets of Victorian England. In 1846, he married another English Victorian poet, Elizabeth Barrett. Born 1806, died 1861. Both poets were Christians and were also very popular in America. Expressions of gratitude are heard from many for the welcome rain from those outside the limits of the water system. Great inconvenience and hardship have been experienced by the protracted drought. The John Edwards Hose Company will hold a social dance in Abbott's Hall, Ford's Village, Saturday evening, January 21st. Music by Gilmore's Orchestra of Lowell. The first grand entertainment and social dance, given by St. Catherine's Temperance Society, will be held in Healy's Hall, Graniteville, Friday evening, January 20th. Music by the Elite Orchestra. An excellent program has been arranged, consisting of vocal and instrumental music of a high order by local talent, assisted by out-of-town artists. An excellent old-fashioned supper will be served in Lower Town Hall. Sounds like a good time. The next section is called Congregational. The annual roll call and business meeting of the Congregational Church will be held next Monday at 2 p.m. Preceding this will be a dinner served at 12 o'clock, which will probably prove the pleasant gathering together of the church family that it has in previous years. A bi-monthly distribution of a church calendar is a recent innovation at the services, appropriate to the week of prayer. An additional prayer service, beside the regular one at the vestry on Wednesday afternoon, was held at the home of Mrs. John McMaster at the East Village on Tuesday. There was a good attendance for a rainy evening. Last Sunday morning, the first day of the year, the services were of special interest, the pastor's message both morning and evening being expressly appropriate. At the close of the morning service, the communion service was observed. That's the news in Westford for the week ending January 7th, 1911. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will plan to join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.